Number 35 in the 50 most relevant players for SuperCoach, AFL Fantasy and Dream Team for 2025. I've given that position to Carlton, Ruckman, Tom De Koning. There's so much upside here. Is there an element of risk? And what is this season going to unfold like for him, for Carlton, for fantasy coaches thinking they might be on a cherry 2.0 type run? Okay, it's a little hyperbolic. He's nowhere priced to value, but you need that in the first 30 seconds of a podcast, don't you? Joining me on this podcast for the second time this series, and this should be a good omen for people confident in this kind of breakout option of a guy being someone you hold and dominates for a year. Last year, he held and was on the episode for Lockie Whitfield. It was the winning piece of the puzzle for him getting a top 20 finish in AFL Fantasy. He's already done Jaden Short, so bank him in. I guess Mitch Casey from the Ball Boys. We can lock in Tom De Koning now too, episode over.
Yeah, well, 100% success rate is, sample size of 1. You can take that to the bank, I think. So, yeah, that's what we're all about. So I think, that was a good episode. I'll see you guys next time.
All right, that'll be it. Play the music. No, just... There is a ton we got to unpack, although it is a good omen we could run with. An average last year in the high 80s in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, and 87.8 means he's priced a 900K guy for you in AFL Fantasy and basically that too in Dream Team. While SuperCoach, he's already 101 seasonal average. He's better than I think people realize until they got into their team pickers and realized he's already a triple figure averaging ruckman. And he's, as a result of that, going to set you back at $547,100. 17 games last year, and an unfortunate number that we seem to be getting with the games played for Tom has a team component to it over the last couple of years, so we will talk about that in this episode. But Mitch, he's been such an interesting player to watch over his career. I know Carlton fans have been screaming out ever since Matthew Cruiser departed the club for somebody else to come and support this, arguably one of the most star-studded midfields going around. And then for portions of last year, we were treated, and Carlton fans and the fantasy community started to see not just growth spurts or quarters from Tom De Koning, but week upon week of him finally delivering on his potential.
Yeah, he had a very, very good season. Obviously, you had some interruptions throughout the season with injury, but he's a kind of a guy that he's not what I would say is we call it traditional ruckman, but in terms of the way he can sort of rack up possessions, use the ball decently, especially for a ruckman, take contested marks, be involved in score involvements. He's a very good player. He's a very good young player as well. So. And we'll talk about it in a second. I think his success and the way he can allow Carlton to play, I think will ultimately further the success of Carlton as a footy club this season.
There's certainly some interesting links to be able to draw between his performances and Carlton's victories in 2024. Look, last year, an 87.8 AFL Fantasy and Dream Team average came because of 7 tons. Just that one score that hit real ceiling territories of a 131. But again, if you jumped on him at any point of time during last year, it was significant value based on price point to return. And you're just hoping for more and more improvement, a bit of natural development, a little bit of other structural pieces to go alongside it to hold that down. While in SuperCoach, the 101.5, 8 tons, but a crazy good conversion rate. 6 of those scores up over 120. And so now this is the territories where he's starting to compete in a line that has got some big scores that historically over the last 2 years, we've looked to VC and C a lot of players through this line. The Mark Pittonet splits have to be discussed here, Mitch, don't they? There's 7 games with Pittonet, 10 games without. It's basically a 26 points per game upside in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, and a whopping 39 points per game of upside in SuperCoach. We're talking right on the cliff of averaging 100 in fantasy and over 115 in SuperCoach. If we get anywhere near those numbers, we're getting 10 points per game of upside at a minimum in fantasy and 15 points per game of upside in SuperCoach. if the Pittonet splits of last year come into 2025, all of a sudden, this seems to be why and where all the excitement around Tom being a value and a premium pick all in one seems to be aligning.
Yeah, and those splits as well even include an injury affected game in round 19 as well, where he only scored the 61. He played less than 70% time on ground. So you could, if you take that game out, I know that sometimes people don't love to do that, but if you do, he is averaging over 100, 102.7 in AFL Fantasy with that. So it's definitely the type of pick where you go, okay, you're getting someone priced just a bit below 90 who can go over 100. He's in the right age bracket as well. You know, we see these rucks around this time in terms of their career. This is the time where your Tim English's breakout, your Tristan Sherry's of last year breakout, way back when your Brodie Grundys and Max Gorns really hit their straps. It's that prime age bracket for rucks especially. So it is sort of all starting to come together. Now, you mentioned before, compared to some of the other guys, because he did have such a good season last year, that he is a little bit more elevated in price compared to what we had to pay for Sherry last year. So the margin for error is a little bit smaller because you're paying up a little bit more. But I don't think that should dissuade people from having a look at him as the value ruck, I think, for this season, or at least one of a few options to definitely consider.
The ruck structure for this year completely fascinates me. It's why already through the 50 most relevant, and just letting you know, still to come, there's a high volume of ruckman in the 50 most relevant this year, arguably more than I've ever put before, because I'm genuinely convinced the R1 and R2 spots and how you choose to fill them, let alone in SuperCoach and Dream Team, should you choose to use that spot as a starting squad with your flex option, all of a sudden, the ruck structures impact how deep and heavy you can go, probably more in your midfield and defensive lines in terms of premiums, mid prices, and ultimately how many cash cows you've got on the field. It's an interesting trend to watch the development of Tom De Koning over the last couple of years. What does this look like in your eyes? You alluded some of the other rucks that came in at a different price point last year, but are there some breakout markers just using AFL Fantasy, so it's just pure raw data rather than the SuperCoach, which has obviously the hit-outs to advantage, the score involvements, those factors, just the pure data markers that could help us maybe either get some trust or some concern about whether or not Tom's heading to this breakout territory that I think many in the community certainly at least hope, if not expect, for 2025.
Yeah, so I've gone back and I've looked at some, because we've had a few ruckmen in the last sort of handful of years that have broken out and made some big strides on their averages. And each time there's been some markers in terms of, okay, we can kind of start to see these coming. So one of the big factors that we can start to look at here is, especially when a ruckman has flashes of number one ruck or solo ruck potential, that's when we sort of see those sort of things happen. So there's four main ruckmen that I wanted to look at, basically. Tristan Sherry, Rowan Marshall, Tim English, and Max Gorn. Max Gorn, not necessarily a breakout, but a re-emergence because of the absence of a Luke Jackson and the other guys, a Brodie Grundy as well, going back into solo ruck territory. So these players were all players that we could kind of see when they do have that solo ruck role, that they could break out and have big seasons. So I sort of took the points per minute of the ruckman that I listed there, those four ruckmen, in games where they were playing as solo ruck, 70% CBAs or more, and compared them to the points per game or points per minute from Tom De Koning. So in solo ruck games, points per minute, Tom De Koning was a 1.04 points per minute. Now, this one's going to, he's the flavor of the month. Tristan Sherry, the last year, 2023, his points per minute was exactly the same, 1.04. So we all remember that early game where he got injured, scored a bunch of points in the first half of the first quarter, and everyone was saying he was leading the points per minute. So that type of points per minute applies to a Tom De Koning as well. The year before that, in 2021 and 2022, so a few years ago now, when Rowan Marshall was splitting time, when he also had the solo ruck duties, he went for a 1.01, so slightly less than what Tom De Koning was doing Tim English in 2021, before his breakout year, in games at 70% CBAs or more, he was at 0.88. So his markers were lower. And Max Gawn in 2023, when Brodie Grundy was there, in the games that he was solo, he went at a 1 point per minute game. So tied with Tristan Sherry as the highest points per minute ruckman in the years prior to their breakout. Now, Tristan Sherry's points per minute last year, when obviously he went 114, he was at a 1.08. So just narrowly edging out Tom De Koning, but it is very interesting to say that when this guy's on the field and he is the solo ruck, he can definitely score up there with the very elite in this game. And that's not factoring in any natural improvement or anything like that. Like we said, for a ruckman who is still, getting a bit older, getting a bit more experience in that number one ruck role. So the markers to me are there. Whether or not he can put it all together for a full season is maybe a different question. But I think if he's given the opportunity, he has the ability to shine so far based on those markers.
I think the beauty of his price point too, across all the formats, certainly more naturally in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, where he's under that 90 marker, he's just hit that low component in SuperCoach, is still that conversation around, we don't have to retain these players' services for the 24 weeks of the year. Like, if Tom gets you to that mid-season buy and he gives you that look and see at who are the top two rucks, is it Marshall? Is it Cherry? Does Gawn maintain that spot? Can English rebound back? He becomes this really valuable piece that whether or not he becomes up to that top end of the tree that you alluded, and there is that pathway for him to do that, he becomes a serviceable guy across the formats, because AFL Fantasy, 2 trades a week, it feels easier to do that. SuperCoach, you've now got such an absolute abundance of trades compared to what you had 5 years ago. You've got the boosts where some weeks you can now make 3 trades per week in normal weeks, let alone in the mid-season multi-buys where that increases up to 4 if you've got a boost available to you. It's not just, if Tom doesn't become a premium, it's a bust of a year. If he just adds 5 to 8 points per game of value and becomes the pathway of seeing who is the top 2 rucks, is that a bust? Feels probably too strong a term for you, Mitch, and probably feels too strong for me to say, but is that an okay outcome if all he does is holds around his price point with maybe a little bit of upside, knowing he's got that Richmond matchup in round 1, which is good for rucks, let's be honest? Is that enough for you, or does he have to add that 10 to 15 points to really be a winning pick?
I think he does need to outperform his price. I think if he holds his price where he's at, I would consider it a quote-unquote failed pick. It's not a disaster. It's not going to derail your season. But when you are comparing him to the other options where you've got the other players in their line in terms of Tristan Sherry, Rowan Marshall, yes, even if they maintain their average, the difference is you can captain those guys, whereas you're not going to captain a Tom De Koning, obviously. So the value of maintaining your average at 110 versus maintaining your average at 90 are 2 different ball games, because every point you're getting there, you're getting 2 of them. So I do think he needs to at least close the gap between those players. But remember, you can do that a number of different ways. You can have him go up in price, but you could also have those other guys fall back down in price. So in terms of the comparison, it's not just a 1-to-1. You can start to think about things happening in a different way. The upside of him going further up versus Rowan Marshall doesn't really have any more upside. There's no more, like, he already is the sole ruckman. He already has put up his career high in points per game. So there's not too much upside from that point of view. But you would just have to maintain that to still win out if they both maintain the same average, I think, there. So I do think he needs to go up. But if he does maintain, it's not a disaster. Plus, you can pivot and make other moves. He's also not in that Tristan Sherry mark where last year it takes a complete restructure to get to one of those big dogs. He's about 300,000 away from a Rowan Marshall. Look, it's not ideal, but it is doable to do a little mini restructure. Maybe it is a premium down to a mid-pricer, him up to one of those big dog rucks. It's not a break your team to fix that option compared to someone who, like Tristan Sherry, was priced in the 60s last year. If that went wrong, I think you've got some more ability to pivot at that price point.
Yeah, it's peeling down to a rookie, and now De Koning up. problem solved. Like you said, not ideal, but it's not 2 weeks to get yourself there. So you're definitely not stuck in rough structure purgatory. I do want to talk about the Mark Pittonet effect a little bit more on the headache that it could bring coaches, and is that a turn-off factor in selection in a moment. But we mentioned it right near the start of this episode about how Carlton won a lot more of these games when he moved into that solo ruck spot without Mark. And I'm curious, do you have a theory around that? Is that just as much about the opponents that they had? Is it a specific causation? Is it just a correlation that happened to run alongside that, or with the Mark in, Mark out, or is there another piece that maybe we haven't factored as a community of why that could have unfolded?
Yeah, like I think the stats they are pretty alarming, and I ran into this when I was doing my research early on. But they played 10 games where Tom De Koning was a solo ruck. In those 10 games, they won 9 of them. So a 90% rate is it's pretty solid. And the only game that they lost was to GWS in round 17. It was away, and it was by 2 goals.
Yeah.
Conversely, on the other side, there was 14 games where Pittonet was in the team. They went 4-10, and the wins that they went up against. Now, one of them was GWS. Okay, we'll give that's a good win for them. But the other wins were against Melbourne, who were a bit of a rabble. They won by 1 point in that game as well. The 2 wins were against Richmond and against West Coast. So you would expect them to beat them anyway. So they're pretty damning stats. And whilst I don't necessarily think it is Tom De Koning just stepping in, or Pittonet is so bad that he's just dragging his team through the mud, but what I do think it does for a team, especially like Carlton, is it changes their structure pretty substantially. They've got 2 of the best key forwards in their side, in Curnow and why am I forgetting his name? Mackay sitting up there. Yeah. So they've got some great targets, tall targets as it is. Adding a third tall as your secondary ruckman who's resting forward and Tom De Koning, it slows them down. It also just makes things a little bit more confusing. Harry Mackay is a very capable chop-out ruckman as well. So in terms of a structure point of view, I could very easily see how just going one fewer tall players in their side could be a big advantage for them, because you're not really losing out anything in the ruckman, but you're gaining an extra element of speed, you're gaining an extra element of pressure, and it obviously it shows in the record. And I think, whilst I'm not the coach of Carlton, I think with all the talk of I think he's in a contract year this year around it. Obviously, the disappointment that Carlton went through last season, only just scraping into the finals. When you've got such a stark difference in performance with a certain structure, they'll definitely be looking at that. I think it'd be very hard not to. So, very, very interesting stats there.
It bodes well for those that structurally want to have Tom De Koning again, whether or not it's because they believe there's the pathway to premium territories and he becomes close enough, if not becomes a top 2 territory ruck himself, or at least gets you the look and see and a relatively low price point stepping stone at some point during the year. That's really encouraging. Probably the greatest knock or concern that people would have and feel justified in not starting Tom is this uncertainty around whether or not Pittonet comes in. And there were multiple times last year where it felt odd and weird. And Ethan, you mentioned that that couple of months in the middle of the year where Carlton looked strong, and then it felt almost bizarrely. It wasn't, I know there were some injury impacted games of Tom during the season, but there were moments where you're like, what are we doing bringing Pittonet in? And now all of a sudden it kills TDK scoring. And that feels like that's the greatest concern and reason for people fading away from starting Tom De Koning, because all the other stat elements that you've rolled out beautifully throughout this podcast in fantasy, Dream Team, SuperCoach, its value, its upside, and it's right on the tip of becoming a top 2 ruckman across the formats. What would you say to a coach that's concerned about the Pittonet effect? Is that justified? Is that a valid reason to fade? And if it isn't, what would be kind of the response back to a coach that might say that?
Yeah, it's interesting because I even look back at last year, and Mark Pittonet didn't appear into the side until round 5. Those first 4 games that Carlton played, they won all 4 of them. The only reason that they went away from that early on was because in round 5, Mark Pittonet came in, but you got a very early injury from a Tom De Koning coming in at round 12. So it is concerning to say that okay, there was no injuries that forced Mark Pittonet into the side. They were doing really well. Why change it up? That is definitely a concern. However, you look at this season again, they look like they're going to get off to a fairly good start. I would have thought. Obviously, you've got the Richmond matchup round 1. You've also got West Coast and North Melbourne in the first 6. So you would think out of their first 6, they've got 3 nearly walk-up wins. Collingwood, Bulldogs, and Hawthorn. All I don't think that you'd say that they're definitely not likely to win. All of those 3 games are at either the MCG or at Marvel Stadium. So there's a very real possibility that Carlton get off to a really solid start. And again, it's that sort of mindset of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The question would be that obviously last year they had a similar kind of a start and they still brought a Mark Pittonet in. So it does raise concerns. However, obviously the season didn't go the way that they had hoped. So, insanity is the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. I think it is kind of going to be a case that if you don't see Mark Pittonet in that round 1, you are taking a semi leap of faith. But I think, especially with that round 1 matchup, and we might talk about their run in terms of up against Ruckman, you're at least going to get off to a solid start, I believe. And then it's sort of a case of, okay, if you see Mark Pittonet come into the side at any point, it's your sign to sort of get off ship. You've also got the early round buys, which make it best 18. That can give you a little bit of that protection early on in case you drop a really poor floor score with a Mark Pittonet coming back to the side. So there is a little bit of inbuilt protection early on in the season. And then after those early buy rounds are gone, hopefully if Carlton have had a bit of a good start to the year, they've come up against some easier matchups that you can maybe start to see this snowballing and you're getting some good price movements, and Carlton and your fantasy teams are off to a flying start.
Really, the worst case scenario for an owner is this: no Pittonet in round 1, De Koning Ruck solo, and then in round 2 onwards, Pittonet comes in. But you need to build that risk profile into your starting squad side. And risk profile isn't just around injury players. It's about guys that have a little bit of role volatility. You could throw a Jordan Dawson into that exact same conversation for some that going, oh, he should be, and the narrative and the pathway is here. But if this one variable changes, well, their scoring is going to diminish. So I think you've mapped out, Mitch, this beautiful pathway for us that even if the worst case scenario happens is no Pittonet round 1, but Pittonet round 2, the best 18 protects us, and in AFL Fantasy, we'll have had a few price movements by then. Should a Marshall drop a little bit of cash, it might only be that 250,000 in AFL Fantasy. We'll have had one price movement in SuperCoach that potentially could be quite significant. And again, with the rolling price cycle of a 3-game cycle, if it is going pear-shaped for you in SuperCoach, you can pivot across and make that move, because that is the worst case scenario, is no Pittonet, because if Pittonet's named round 1, we're off. We need to look at the parachute option of our structure. We're just not going to go there. The worst case scenario is no Pittonet round 1, and then he pops in round 2. But Mitch has mapped out this beautiful way where, while it's not ideal, it can be protected. And it's just a headache that could come. But as long as you've got the painkillers ready to go, you should be able to navigate it. Look, if any of the following things, Mitch, come out in the preseason, I think for those not starting him structurally for whatever reason, are going to find it hard not to go there. And they would be a significant mid to long-term injury to Pittonet, which we do not hope for, by the way, or Michael Voss and the coaching team and the players reinforcing, no, we will run a 1 ruck structure. Tom is our guy. Harry's going to play that relief like we saw at the start of the year. That is how we are going to play football. And you can really only trust people at their word in that instance. If one of those two sentiments come out of Carlton strongly, it is going to be hard to not see the value that sits on top of him over a big portion of the year to not go there. I'm curious, for those that are in the set and forget camp, and if one of those variables come, does that change a set and forget coach's mindset? Because if it is, then maybe there's some cracks in the argument that set and forget is the right approach.
Yeah, I mean, if you're fading Tom De Koning because you're worried about, Mark Pittonet lurking in the shadows there, then I think if something happens to him or they've come out and explicitly said, no, we're going to go for you have to, a good coach should be able to see new information, new things come to light and be able to change their mind. It doesn't mean that you're not sticking to your guns or anything like that. If that comes out, yes, you should be doing that if that was your reason. If you don't believe in him and his body, or if you don't believe in his scoring ability or whatever, then maybe that doesn't change your mind, because that's a different reason as to why you're not starting him. In terms of maybe you're worried about the price tag or the price point at which you're paying for, I'd question, did you start Tristan Sherry or Brodie Grundy or Max Gawn last year? Was that successful? I mean, yeah, they were pretty successful. So the set and forget, look, I reckon it's such a big thing because it rhymes, and people love things that rhyme. And look, it hasn't actually been successful really since the Brodie Grundy, Max Gawn era when they were 10, 15, 20 points better than the next best ruckman. And there wasn't any other options that were breaking out simultaneously at that time. Since then, we've had a lot of value options: Rowan Marshall, Tim English, Tristan Sherry, Brodie Grundy, Max Gawn. All of these guys come in at value beforehand, and they've been successful. Riley O'Brien has even won a number of years ago as well. So we can kind of reminisce on this proven strategy that's worked. But really, in the last 5-6 years, it's only maybe been with hindsight, the right strategy maybe one of those seasons. So I would encourage everyone to at least consider other structures if you haven't already, because and you might not go there in the end of the day, but if you're gonna your fingers in your ears and la 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 la, I'm not thinking about any other structure, I think you're doing self a disservice as well.
Yeah, it's a really good summary. Look, there's a couple of injury-impacted games last year. To be fair, one's a precaution rather than an actual in-game, we've got to adjust here. So a little bit concerning, for sure, to see a couple of those games. And you look through some of the career games played and you see a lot of teens. But also part of that is also Carlton trying a lot of different things. And, Pittonet, you're in. De Koning, you're in. Whereas really last year was the first time Tom was given the keys to the ruck and to the midfield, and he took it with both hands and absolutely charged. And so anyone, of course, that you see a couple of injuries in a year, you show a level of intrigue, a level of, I'll keep a mental note of that. But to me, I don't know about to you, Mitch, but to me, I look at the games played, I look at the injuries and go, okay, it's a good factor, but they're not reasons to fade or jump off in my eye.
Yeah, I mean, and you said at the top of the show, last year I talked about Lockie Whitfield as my only player in the top 50 most relevant, and that would have been a reason for a lot of people to not start Lockie Whitfield. Myself included last year with Dane Zorko. A lot of us didn't jump on Dane Zorko because he's quote-unquote injury-prone. 2 years ago, when Tim English took off an average 120, he was injury-prone. So these guys, especially when they're in the right age, in my opinion, and it is like this prime age for ruckman, as long as you don't have any sort of issues in the preseason going into the season, I don't think we can honestly rely on the fact that they've been injured to accurately predict that they're going to get injured this season. I think it's a big fallacy in all fantasy sports that, one of the famous sayings that I like to go for is you're injury prone until you're not. And conversely, you're an Iron Man until you're not. So a lot of the times these injury-prone players can steer people off, but they often, obviously, with injuries inbuilt into your average last year, it presents value. Plus, it makes them that much bit more unique because other people are hesitant to jump on. And I think you'd like to talk about if they're injury-prone, that's the reason you're not going for them. Well, then they whack a couple of 120s on your head. Well, what do you do then? Do you now spend a trade to trade them in? You're a little bit more hesitant. It makes it a bit more of a difficult decision than if you just start with them, bank those games in while they are healthy, especially if they've had a good preseason, and then try and get away with it there.
Yeah, that's a really good summary. Look, Tom De Koning is going to be an interesting player for so many reasons in our classic sides across all of the formats, because structurally, whether he's R1 or R2, it opens up a lot of other avenues of what you could do with your cash, or if you're fading him because of some of the reasons that have either got some validity to them or enough of a reason to not go there. Wow, if those don't come out, we could be staring a gift horse of value that's scoring premium territories in the mouth. So this is going to be an interesting player to not only consider and ponder through the rest of January, February, and the start of March, but to watch those first 2 to 3 months of the season, because he feels like a player that if he does what we expect a solo TDK to do, well, value, high scoring performance, and a look at the top end of the rucks all in one player, that could be an absolute knockout pick with little to no burn, with the pathways that Mitch has shared throughout this episode to how you can be a little bit protected. Here at the Coaches Panel, we choose to draft on the Keeper platform in 2025. But where he goes on draft day, it does feel, Mitch, again, regardless of the platform or the format you choose to draft, it feels like there's a pretty clear top 4 rucks that will go first in Cherry, English, Marshall, and Gaunt. They're in no particular order, by the way. I feel like the universal 4 off the board, but it kind of opens up into a new dimension beyond that. And SuperCoach definitely will open up some new names, probably ahead of AFL Fantasy and vice versa. So from an AFL Fantasy scoring territory, you've done some good ranks for us already and some range of outcomes. Where do you personally have this incredible potential young ruckman headed in 2025?
Well, right now, according to my projection, you've got those big 4, and I agree with you. I've got Tom De Koning next. I have him 5th in the ruck. Now, you don't actually have to draft him there, and I do think in drafts this year, I'd be happy to draft those first 2, Sherry and Marshall, in the first round. I would then prefer to wait a long time before if I didn't get those 2, to draft my ruckman, because this season, or in last season as well, we've got more like solo rucks than I think we've had in a long time. I think last year we had 15 or over 10 rucks averaged 90 points per game. I think you're going to see at least maybe 15 to 16 rucks average 85 per game this season. So I have him at number 5. I think if you can get him sort of late in your draft as one of the later rucks off the board with that 89 next to his average, I think you've got a massive, massive bargain. So I've got him at 5, but I wouldn't be reaching early on to get him, because if someone else grabs him, oh well, I'll just grab one of these other ruckmans. I think the hunting rucks is going to be a big strategy this year, because there actually are quite a few good options that can give you 90 any given week. And I think, yeah, we've just got more depth in that position than we have than other seasons, I believe.
Yeah, like guys such as a Darcy Cameron, a Riley O'Brien, a Kieran Briggs, these are not names that you're reaching for on draft day. And all of that 90 territories in AFL Fantasy and have all shown a pushing, if not an emergence, over that 100 range in SuperCoach. Jared Witts is another sits in that place. So you're right. If you're reaching for rucks in 2025 outside of the first round for those 2, I think you're probably overpaying when the upside is so much in that mid to late part of the draft. That is for sure. Hey, Mitch, loving talking fantasy footy with you all of the time. For people that haven't had a chance to either play AFL Fantasy or haven't yet had a chance to come across the Fantasy Ball Boys podcast, 1, you've already missed an episode of the 50 most relevant if that's the case. But 2, where can we keep in touch with you? And I know you guys are pumping out the content every couple of days at the moment. Where can we have a look and a listen to that?
Yeah, you can find us at Ball Boys Fantasy on YouTube and on wherever you get your podcasts. You can check us out and look at my very nice on the visual medium, or if you see my smug face, you can go and you can listen to us on the audio. I will say as well, I can't make the specific announcement just yet, but if you're an AFL Fantasy what I like to call a sweaty. If you like to dig deep into your stats, you want to take this game seriously. Stay tuned in February because we will have a very exciting announcement to unveil. Stay tuned. Maybe some more details to come. So I can't say exactly what yet, but in February there'll be a big announcement. And if you're keen on your AFL fantasy, you'll want to hear this one. So stay tuned.
I am yet to hear the term AFL fantasy sweats, but I feel like I'm going to hear it a lot throughout the month of February now. So thank you, Mitch. I appreciate you, and I love what these boys do as a podcast. If you want high quality advice, great strategy, insight, unique perspectives, and a heap of fun right along the way, what Mitch and Luke and the guys have been doing is absolutely just knockout. You've got to go check it out. If you are an AFL fantasy coach or you just love fantasy content and you just want to hear more and more of it, this is definitely one of the podcasts. If you're not tuning into it all the time, it's definitely one you need to get onto. In a moment, I got a clue for you about who's next in the 50 most relevant. If you are watching this on YouTube, you'd see both of us are rocking the hats today. Yes, the fearless hair has been hidden. His hat might be a little bit more. Man, it's nice. It's not too bad from you. If you do want to let us know, if you are watching this on YouTube, what you think Tom's going to average in 2025, comment below and let us know. All the details for the podcast, for the social media links, how to get in touch with Mitch and the team. We've put that in the description of the episode, so you don't have to go too far. You don't have to rewind back to recheck it out and put it in the description. You can click on that link and it will take you exactly there to watch, to listen, and to connect. And while you're in the description of this episode, you can keep in touch with us across social media. Get yourself some Coaches Panel merch if you want it, and become a Patreon. There's a bunch of different rewards our Patreons get, whether you're a Breakout, Premium, or a Cash Cow tier. There's a tier that is right for you and a bunch of different rewards. We would so greatly appreciate your support during this 2025 preseason. All right, number 34. I think we're hitting tomorrow. This one's interesting because he did what I think every fantasy coach and fantasy content creator loves. Has a barnstorming end to 2023, giving us some flags that maybe this guy could be an absolute knockout pick in 2024. You know what? He validated and even elevated his scoring into 2024 after that stunning end to 2023. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, does this premium that was not won in 2023, but is certainly won in 2025, it's going to be hard to go up another gear. But there's a way that it could. But there's some changes afoot at the club that might just hurt him. It might not hurt him from being a premium, but it might be reason enough to fade him in your starting squad. Who are we talking about? You'll find out tomorrow in the 50 most relevant.